Good evening. I want to welcome you here to the Anglican Parish of St. Paul in the Anglican Diocese of Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. Pardon me. We're streaming live from our parish here at St. Paul's, and my name is Myron Penner. I'm the rector here at St. Paul's, and I'm very happy to be joined this evening with two guests. One is Douglas Herink. Douglas is Professor Emeritus of Theology at the King's University here in Edmonton. He is obviously a theologian, a researcher, and an author. His publications focus mostly in modern theology in St. Paul. He's got several books out, but this evening we'll be discussing his most recent book called Resurrecting Justice, Reading Romans for the Life of the World. We're going to be doing this over the rest of the Tuesdays in Lent, so please join us, and if you find this edifying and helpful, invite other people and your friends and tune in next Tuesday at 7 p.m. Mountain, I almost said Standard Time. We're on Daylight Time still. So Mountain Daylight Time, 7 p.m. in Alberta, Canada, if you're trying to figure that out from some other time zone. But also to his right and further to my right is another colleague of mine here in the diocese. It's the Reverend Jordan Haney Ware. She's the archdeacon here in our diocese for social justice and community connection. She is rector at the Anglican Church of the Good Shepherd. She is a priest, an author, a podcaster. You can find her on various platforms, but just Google her if you want to find her, and I'll post some information and connections to her later as well. But we're talking now in this series for Lent in our parish about this book that Doug has written called Resurrecting Justice. And really what he's focusing on is the concept of justice, but looking at it as Paul, the role that it plays in Paul's letter to the Romans, that letter that almost nobody has read. No, obviously, it's one of the most read and commented on books in Scripture. And so in Resurrecting Justice, what Doug is doing is he's inviting us to read this as a treatise on justice. And I, for one, had never heard that concept before Doug started talking to me about it. So I'm excited to hear what Doug has to say to us this morning, or this evening. We're looking at, the title of this session is The Apocalypse of Justice, and we're looking at the first three chapters of Romans, which also correspond to the first three chapters of his book. And sort of as an overarching question or set of questions, we're asking the question, well, what is justice according to Paul's letter to the Romans? And how is that justice connected to the gospel that Paul announces? And so I'm going to hand it over to Doug, and he's going to sort of set this up for us, and then Jordan and I will talk with him, and I hope we have some fruitful conversation.
All right. Thank you, Myron. And welcome to all of you who are
Can I just, sorry,
yeah,
Doug,
absolutely.
I forgot one very crucial thing. We are live streaming this, and there is a bit of a delay, but we welcome questions and comments from I almost said peanut gallery, from those of you who are streaming online. So please, if you have a question, just post that as a comment on the platform that you're using, whether that's YouTube or whether that's Facebook, and I will pick it up, or John, who is at the back running the tech, will pick it up, and we will get to it. But you may have to wait a bit, so if you get something, maybe post it early, and hopefully we'll get it in time to discuss it. So, sorry, go ahead, Doug.
No problem. Okay, thank you. And thank you for those of you who are joining this conversation online. Thank you for being here, or there, as the case may be. So yes, I wrote this book on Romans out of the conviction that grew over a good deal of time. I've been working with Romans as a scholar for decades, but over time it became clear to me that Paul was addressing questions of justice in Romans. And one of the things I had to do is ask the question, why is that so hard for us to see? Because very few people think that Paul treats questions of justice at all, let alone that Romans treats questions of justice. And so one of the things I had to do was highlight the fact that for Paul, there's a Greek word, dikaiosune, which gets translated into English as righteousness. Now, righteousness we typically think of as something having to do with our personal and religious and moral life, but little beyond that. And by and large, we've tackled Paul's letter to the Romans as a book that has to do with righteousness, our righteousness or lack thereof on the one hand, and God's righteousness on the other hand, which is manifest in Jesus Christ. And so the first thing I had to do was just kind of unpack the thought that actually with the word dikaiosune, Paul did not have two words, justice on the one hand and righteousness on the other. He had one word, dikaiosune. And this word covered a whole spectrum of concepts, all the way from personal moral uprightness to questions of justice, justice for the ruler, justice in a state, justice in the courts, and so on and so forth. And so in some respects, the book is a kind of experiment. What would it be like if we took those words that are associated with dikaiosune, and there's a variety of different forms of that word, what if we read those as speaking to the issue of justice? And so I applied myself to this task, and those words occur many times throughout the letter to the Romans, more than anywhere else in the New Testament, and more than anywhere else in Paul. So I thought, let's do an experiment. Let's see what it looks like if we read Paul's letter to the Romans as addressing the most fundamental questions of justice. And so that's how this book arose. I need to say maybe a couple of other things. If you've had a chance to look at the book, you'll see that the book is divided into two parts. The first part is called, is it called Apocalyptic Justice or Apocalypse of Justice? I can't remember.
Apocalyptic Justice.
Apocalyptic Justice. And the second part is called Messianic Life. And so in my first chapter, I try to explain those two words. The word apocalyptic often conjures up in our minds scary things, right? An asteroid headed toward Earth that's going to destroy everything, or a massive natural event like a tsunami or something like this, or some kind of massive war or nuclear event, these kinds of things. So typically we think apocalypse is something really scary that kind of means a fundamental alteration of the world, a destruction of all kinds of things and life itself, okay? But apocalyptic, the word apocalypse is used frequently in the New Testament to speak of what happens in God's arrival in Jesus Christ. In fact, Paul frequently uses it to speak of the event of Jesus Christ. For Paul, the apocalypse is good news, okay? It's apocalypse because it is world-altering news. And that's why I think it's important to use that word, apocalyptic, because what I do want to conjure up is the fact that for Paul, the coming of Jesus Christ, the advent of God in person in Jesus Christ is world-altering. It fundamentally changes everything. And so it is an apocalypse in that sense. But it's world-altering in the good sense. It brings about justice. It brings about life. It brings about healing and salvation. So I use the word, but the word is always centered on the reality of Jesus Christ himself and God's advent, God's coming, God's arrival in Jesus Christ. The second word I use mostly toward the end of the book, in the last part of the book, is messianic. Now, messianic, I could go into a lot of dimensions of the word messianic, but what I mean most specifically by the word messianic is that the good news is focused on Jesus, Messiah.
Mm-hmm.
And Messiah is not, so everybody knows that, many people know that the word Jesus Christ comes from the Greek Jesus Christou, and that comes from Christos, which means anointed one, and so on. But Christos translates the concept of Mashiach, Messiah, in the Old Testament. And when Paul uses the word Jesus Christ, he's not giving us Jesus' second name.
Mm-hmm.
He's giving us Jesus' title,
Right.
okay, or his role. And that role is the sovereign one, okay, the Lord, the Messiah. And certainly the Messiah has deep Jewish connections. So Paul also adds to that often Jesus Christ, our Lord, okay, our sovereign one. So for Paul, what does life look like if it's life oriented toward the Messiah? Well, it's messianic life. And in the second part of the book, then I unpack what messianic life looks like. That is life lived, that is oriented by, shaped according to the reality of Jesus Christ. So these are just a few introductory comments to the book, and I kind of unpack that in the first, those aspects in the first chapter of the book. Should I carry on, or do you have any?
I have a question, actually,
Okay, yes.
if that's okay. I appreciate this focus you've had on vocabulary here at the beginning, and I appreciate you also drawing this connection and not only Jesus' Jewishness, but also Paul's Jewishness, which I think often gets lost.
Yes.
And I appreciate throughout the book you highlight Paul's Jewishness, and I know we'll get to it when we get to chapter 9, but I wonder if you could explicate for our audience here a little bit about the connection between dikaiosune and the Hebrew word tzedakah. And how are these concepts related, and what are some examples maybe of tzedakah in the Old Testament that maybe in English we read as justice, but actually would be quite comparable to what Paul is meaning by dikaiosune here?
Yeah. Well, there are two words in Hebrew, mishpat and tzedakah. And these words often in the Greek translation,
Mm-hmm.
so there's a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible called the Septuagint. I won't explain what that word means, but that effectively is the Bible that Paul uses. So Paul is not, when he's quoting from Scripture, typically, in fact, I'm not sure of any instance where it's clear that he's quoting from the Hebrew Scriptures. He, in fact, almost...
The Hebrew version of the Hebrew Scriptures.
Yeah,
Right.
the Hebrew version. That's right. That's right. The Hebrew language version of the Hebrew Scriptures.
Yeah.
Paul virtually invariably quotes from the Greek translation, the Septuagint, of the Hebrew Scriptures.
Could I interrupt? I'll very quickly explain what the Septuagint is. There were 70 rabbis that got together and they translated the Hebrew Bible into Greek, and we call it the Septuagint. So that was the version that all of the Jews and the Hebrews were using in Jesus' day and Paul's day. So,
Right,
yeah.
right. Most of the New Testament actually depends more on that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, which was finished roughly about a century before Paul, I think, if I'm not mistaken.
Mm-hmm.
So those words for justice in the Hebrew Bible, those Hebrew words for justice in the Hebrew Bible, get typically translated into the dikaiosune words, and so Paul is just basically working, if you want to put it this way, he's working conceptually with the Hebrew understanding, with the Old Testament understanding of justice, but bringing that, pouring those concepts into the reality of Christ.
So to sort
Pardon
of
me.
address part of what Jordan was saying, when is it in Micah where it talks about justice rolling down?
Yeah.
It would be this. That word would be translated dikaiosune. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
What you were basically pointing out is, it seems that in the Old Testament we get that some of these concepts are justice related, and we don't necessarily load them up with personal righteousness. But then we get to Paul's letter to the Romans, and suddenly we're seeing all of this talk about dikaiosune as being, well, personal righteousness, which it's not that, but it's more than that.
Yeah,
is what you're saying, right? Is that what you're saying?
That's the point.
It's not that
it's not that Paul isn't interested in personal righteousness, and in fact, what I don't want to be, what I don't want to do in this book is kind of exclude those meanings,
right?
And say, oh, this is all about social justice or political justice, and not about personal righteousness. I'm not saying that. I'm just wanting to experiment with the thought that Paul's concept of justice is much broader than individual personal righteousness.
Right.
I just throw out 3 verses from the Old Testament on page 3 of the book, from the Greek translation of the Old Testament, where they translate the Hebrew words mishpat and tzedakah. And here are 3 of the verses that maybe people are fairly familiar with. So from Psalm 72, O God, give your judgment to the king and your justice, dikaiosune, to the king's son, that he may judge your people with dikaiosune, justice, and your poor with judgment, okay? From Psalm 98, the Lord has made known his salvation. He has revealed his dikaiosune, namely justice, in the sight of the nations. And then from Amos, very famous text.
Not Micah, like I said.
but let
you
judgment.
were thinking of the do justice,
That's right.
love kindness from
Exactly.
Micah, but yes, Amos.
But let judgment roll down as water, and justice, dikaiosune, as a mighty torrent.
Yeah.
So, yes, this is definitely picking up on those words and concepts from the Hebrew Scriptures for sure.
Okay.
So, and so I appreciate, Jordan, that you bring up Paul's Jewishness. I mean, Paul is steeped in Judaism. That's the source of his being and identity. Okay, he's steeped in Judaism. He's steeped in the Old Testament Scriptures, and he never lets that go.
Mm-hmm.
There's to be sure a kind of fundamental alteration of his understanding of the Torah in particular, okay? But Paul never lets go of his Jewishness, and as we will see when we get later on into Romans, in Romans 9 to 11, he engages the whole question of Israel at a very deep and fundamental level, and that's it really is in many ways the kind of center of the whole argument. Yeah.
Yeah, and I found that. We're going to have to wait for it, so tune in on another, it's written down in the schedule there whenever that comes up. But I found that very illuminating. I wanted to ask a question about sort of apocalypse, to sort of kind of, I guess, unpack that a little more, and what Paul is saying. I mean, it's the end of the world, but it seems to me, and tell me if this is what you're saying, that Paul has had also this kind of personal apocalypse, like the end of the world has happened to him. Like his whole world has been apocalypsed. It's been turned upside down and revealed to be, well, as he said at one point, a dunghill, right? Or he actually used much stronger language than that.
Right.
And so he's experienced. So there's kind of, and this is something it's a tension in the book, because I think it's a tension in the letter. There's always this tension between this kind of cosmic, if we can say that, social systems, but there's also always, at the same time, a very personal element. So you write that for Paul, I'm not going to find it here off the top of my head, but basically you say that Jesus is the apocalyptic justice, the cosmic justice, but it's also true that for Paul personally, he is
Yeah.
Paul's personal righteousness and justice,
Yeah.
and has apocalypsed him.
Yeah.
And so he participates in that.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that maybe what Paul is saying is that the point is, this has happened, let's acknowledge it and live in it. That's what it means to be a Christian.
Yeah.
To live in this.
For Paul, everything is apocalypsed. Okay. Everything suffers. Everything suffers the arrival of Christ. Interestingly, you speak of this tension between that very personal and that very cosmic dimension of things. Both of these things, interestingly, come out in Galatians, where Paul says early on in Galatians, I have been crucified with Christ.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, basically what he's saying is, along with Christ, I was killed.
And
nevertheless, I live.
Yeah.
Yet not, it isn't I who live, but Christ who lives in me, okay? And so there's, you could say, that kind of personal apocalypse, that personal event of deconstruction. Paul loses himself, okay? Paul's self is killed in that sense.
Would you say, because this is something that I've been thinking about a bit lately, and I think maybe some of it came out of reading your book, but that I find people, especially in commentaries, they start talking about Paul speaking metaphorically about being crucified with Christ, and I'm writing in the margin, no, he's not being metaphorical here. I don't think he is, because
he's not literally dead, but his whole self.
But he's pushing that metaphor really far. He's not just sort of putting a gloss on it.
That's right. And so you referenced earlier Philippians chapter 3. Paul's self is undone. There's no question that self which existed prior to that encounter with the risen Christ, that self is undone. It doesn't exist any longer. What comes out on the other side is, in fact, not himself, but Christ in him, and he in Christ, okay? So the idea that somehow or other, and so you're right to say, well, not metaphorically, but literally, Paul's self is dead.
He's trying to find language.
Yeah.
And I think he carries it forward beyond just himself. If you look at Romans 6, when in baptism we have died with Christ and we have risen again with Christ, it is metaphorical, but it's also pushing that boundary. When you were talking about apocalypse before, I was thinking about the literal meaning of it as revealing, revelation.
Yes.
And so in Christ, what's really going on in the universe has been revealed. And therefore, once your eyes have been opened to what's really going on in the world, you can't live the same way anymore. Because now it's like in the Matrix when you take the red pill, right? Because now you see it everywhere that you go. And so after we have been baptized and we have died to sin and are alive to Christ, that is a whole paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And I think.
And
Go ahead.
So let me just pick up on the cosmic aspect. So there's this death of the self, but there's also the death of the world. Okay. And interestingly, this also comes out in Galatians right toward the end. May I never boast of anything except the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ. And so really where everything happens for Paul, where the whole apocalypse happens for Paul, is in the crucifixion. And that's why he boasts of the cross, by which the world, the cosmos, has been crucified to me and I to the cosmos, okay? So not only self, but also world for Paul suffers the apocalypse, suffers the crucifixion. And then he goes on to say, for neither circumcision nor uncircumcision, basically the Jewish way of dividing up the whole world, or naming the whole world, is anything but a new creation is everything. And so for Paul, the event of Jesus Christ is the death of the self. It's the death of the world. And on the other side, it is new creation. So you're right that there's this new I that arises after being crucified, but that I is no longer my possession.
Yeah.
And there's this creation that arises after the crucifixion of the world, but this is no longer nameable in any kind of direct sense by the world that we knew before we encountered Christ.
Okay. So to just sort of, I guess, try to bring that down a little bit to sort of the street level, he's basically saying that if you meet Jesus the way I did, you're going to be completely different.
Yeah. That's right.
And that's going to be enacted through baptism. You're going to die to yourself and live a new life that is now characterized in the terms that you use as messianic. Because what I don't want people to listening elsewhere to think is that somehow this is a special life, like the messianic mission. No, this is like, I think living with Jesus as your Messiah is what Paul thinks a normal Christian life is.
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I certainly think so.
And we'll get into this later on, but there's something radically ordinary about it.
Yeah. Well, so far we've talked a lot about the book. How about we start to get into Romans?
Okay.
what happens in the first chapter there? Then when we try to read, and I actually quite appreciate how you set up in the preface and the introduction. You oriented what it is that your task is, and you're giving us a reading of the book of Romans, and there are other readings, and I actually had written out, and I forgot to bring it with me, a reading of Romans that I thought I would like to have heard you give a response to, because it's a very different reading of Romans than you have. And so while you do you're not writing a commentary, but it's kind of a theological commentary.
Yeah.
Would you call it that?
Yeah, I mean, it's, I don't know, it's a reading.
It's a reading.
And a reading just means that I'm not trying to work out all of the details of the language and the sentences and the sentence structure and the paragraphs and the arguments. What I'm trying to do is basically, on the one hand, dive deeply into the text of Romans in its own context, and on the other hand, at the same time, ask, how is this a living text for us in our own time?
Yeah.
And sometimes then you obviously have to pay attention to the details as the first step in that whole process. But the book itself is not bringing all those details out. It's trying to show how these things basically live together, the text of Romans and life in our world today. That's what we're after.
Is it fair to say that one of the goals of your book is to say that if you understand what Paul is talking about, he's talking about justice, and you should be fundamentally concerned with what that is?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the way I get at this is in a bunch of text boxes throughout the book, to ask the reader, or to get the reader to ask questions about their own life.
Yeah.
Right.
So I was just saying earlier before we started, I don't have stories in here. Application stories. I guess what I've wanted the reader to do is by raising a number of questions about a contemporary reader's own life, to get that reader to start thinking, to get you, the reader, to start thinking your own life in terms of what Paul is saying about justice in Romans, and to get to get you thinking about what Paul's saying about justice in Romans in terms of how you think about justice in your own life and in our contemporary world, because it isn't just about me or you. I talk a lot about peoples, nations, relationships, much broader than the individual self, and that's core to the whole book.
And I think one of the difficulties that people have about reading Romans this way is that Paul is not a light theorist. Like he is going, like he is giving us an entire sort of comprehensive theology of the world.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
he's certainly working from it. He's not really necessarily giving it all to us, and so we have to kind of piece it together. Why don't we start to talk then about Romans 1 and what Paul actually is doing there?
Well, and that's a really good lead-in, because from the very first sentence in Romans, Paul is basically redescribing the world within the context of the gospel. What is reality if the gospel is true? Okay, and so as Myron said, the entire letter to the Romans effectively is this effort of Paul's to describe reality and to name our place within reality. And the real beyond all real for Paul is God, and that's where he starts the letter. Okay, and so the first thing Paul needs to do is name God, and this is important, because within Paul's context, within the context of the people who are hearing this letter for the first time, the Romans, the world is construed in many ways according to all of the gods and powers that exist at that time. Virtually any Roman would have a small altar to a household god, but they would also walk out of their dwelling place and find altars on the streets. They would walk into city squares and they would find statues and altars to the gods there. Gods would, as it were, be the guardians of cities. They would be the guardians of various trades and crafts. And then, of course, there are the big gods, right? The gods of Rome that warrant, for example, the Roman emperors. They're the ones who stand behind the Roman emperors, giving them their divine authority and right over people's lives. Mm-hmm. So gods abound, powers abound, and so the first thing that Paul has to do is name the true God. Who is the true God? And in the first few verses, the first 5 verses of the letter, Paul basically says, God is the God of Jesus Christ, the Father of Jesus Christ. God's Spirit of life raises Jesus from the dead. Mm-hmm. Jesus Christ is the sovereign one, and of course, the gods are always sovereign. So Jesus Christ is both sovereign in his divinity and sovereign in his humanity. And so notice all of the things that Paul tackles in just a few verses. He tackles the reality of God. He tackles the reality of sovereignty, authority, rule.
Which tells us this is going to be about justice,
it's
right?
It's going to be about justice.
Because
it's going to be
that's all wrapped up in there.
It's going to be a deeply political message.
Because if Jesus is Lord, then Caesar is not.
Exactly. So it's going to be a deeply political message that that speaks to the reality of the gods, that speaks to the reality of sovereign rule over people's lives. It's going to speak about life. It's about resurrection. So it speaks about life in the here and now, and it speaks about that promised life in communion with God, life in God. So the first 5 verses, I think it's just crucial to see those first 5 verses as basically naming the real. This is Paul saying what the real is. After that encounter with Jesus Christ, reality looks fundamentally different. As Jordan says, one no longer thinks that Caesar is the ruler of all things, right? Maybe he's got his own kind of form of rule in the world. Clearly it has effects in the world. But beyond Caesar, there is Jesus Christ. And he is the sovereign one, okay? Beyond the gods of Rome, ruling them, judging them, in some sense excluding them, is the God of Jesus Christ, the God of Israel. where is the power of life? Well, the power of life is in the Holy Spirit, okay, who raised Jesus from the dead. All of this is just core to the real. I mean, the real is about divine reality. The real is about sovereignty. The real is about life, its source, its meaning, and so on and so forth. All of this just comes out in spades, in a few words, in the first 5 verses of Romans.
As you wrote on page 24, in other words, the reality of justice is rooted in the reality of the Holy Trinity.
Yes.
Because Paul has very clearly named God as Father, Son, and Spirit in that opening. And I think we sometimes miss that. And Paul can't use that language, of course, because there hasn't been the councils that have, have named the Trinity as such. But he's clearly working with this idea of God as Father, Son, and Spirit.
Yes.
And that is going to be the thing that he's basically saying to the Romans, listen.
Yeah.
This thing that is dominating the world around you, particularly the social world, that form of justice, which probably some of them were experiencing as cruelly unjust, that is not the thing that is actually the deepest reality.
That's right.
There is another God who is ruling, who is overall, and so on, and that reality has been revealed to us in Jesus, and it is his Father and the Spirit, and that is the place actually where true justice is going to come from.
Exactly. I mean, the reality of God, the reality of authority, political authority in particular, the reality of life, all of this is found in the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Yeah. Okay. We should probably move on.
Yeah, we should.
I don't know where we are. Okay, so I emphasize that at the very beginning of chapter 2. I pull that theme out. And I won't go into verses 16 and 17 of Romans 1 because it's a dense little passage, and I think it basically gets unpacked as the letter unfolds. What I want to do is move into a large section, Romans 1:18 to 3:20. Now, the fact is, in the book, what I do is I jump directly from chapter 1 of Romans, chapter 1, verse 17, all the way over to chapter 3, verse 21. And so I skip over. I save that next section. I save that section of chapters 1 and 2 and part of 3 for chapter 2 in the book. Now, okay, well, let me just say, why do I jump over to chapter 3:21? Well, chapter 3:21 is where Paul says, but now a justice apart from law has been disclosed, okay? By the way, Paul's already introducing another term, law, of huge importance for all of our lives, okay? But what I wanted to emphasize by jumping from chapter 1, verse 17 to chapter 3, verse 21 of Romans is to say that that whole part that's in between there is enclosed by these gospel declarations. Yeah. Okay? Chapter 1, verses 1 to 5, chapter 1, verses 16 and 17, and then chapters 3, 21 to the end of the chapter. These kind of enclose, these gospel declarations enclose what comes in between. And what comes in between is complex and difficult, so maybe I'll just get to that right now, okay? Here's how I think Paul is working. Okay, so we've got on the outside frame, as it were, of chapters 1 to 3 of Romans, we've got these two gospel declarations. Then, in the next subframes on both sides, we've got what I would call Paul's critique of the reality systems of the world, okay? Those fundamental understandings of the world that are out there. And for Paul, there's two fundamental understandings that he's concerned about. One is the understandings of reality and the world and sovereignty and all things according to the pagan gods, according to the gods of the nations, the gods of Rome, the gods of all of those peoples around the world to whom the law has not been revealed, to whom the law of Moses has not been revealed. As I say, you know, for Paul, as a Jewish thinker, there are two kinds of people out there. There's us, the Torah people, us males, we've been circumcised, and then there's all the rest. Yeah. The people who haven't received Torah, haven't been circumcised, and worship other gods. Okay, so there's two kinds of people in the world. There's Jews and the rest, okay? And to a certain extent, Paul is working from that frame. But he's going to be critical of each of those reality systems, okay? So the first one he addresses in the rest of chapter 1 is that world of the Gentiles, the Gentile nations, the Gentile peoples. They have their gods, and those gods have led them into ruin. They've led them into what Paul calls impiety or false worship of God, false worship of the gods. So that's one thing. And it's led them into injustice, otherwise translated as unrighteousness. Okay? Or in some of our translations, it just is wickedness, but lose sight of the fact that the word used there is basically injustice. Okay? So, from a Jewish point of view, it's easy to be critical of those pagan nations with their gods and see that, you know, the worship of false gods has led to all kinds of chaos and other bad things, injustice and violence and so on. Paul names all this stuff in Romans chapter 1, 18 to 32. So he, as it were, says, you know, there's that system, that whole kind of system of, or that whole kind of way of knowing reality, which has not brought forth justice. Okay? By the way, for Paul, justice just means Jesus. So it has not brought forth a justice which looks like Jesus. Now, there's the other side of things. Namely,
can I interrupt on that, though? Because I think it's important that we not, like, he says that, but when he says that, he's not, I think it's easy to misunderstand what it means to say, well, Paul thinks that Jesus is justice. I think what maybe the deeper reality that he's trying to get at there is that Jesus reveals that all of the things that we think are justice really are not in fact justice, and the thing that we really are striving for are things that can only be found in the reality that's defined by him.
Yeah.
Which climaxes in the cross. I really loved in the first chapter when you were talking about Jesus's temptation, and it's the first week of Lent, right? So we just heard that story,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And what is tempting about what Satan presents to Jesus in the temptation is to be the Messiah that the people were expecting, and to bring this political revolution that with violence was going to bring this, overthrow this regime. I mean, I'm thinking about how the Soviet Union was created. The Tsarist regime was corrupt, and it was unjust, and it was hurting people, and it's very understandable that people would want to violently overthrow it.
Of course.
And yet we now know, with all of the hindsight that we have, that continued to lead to injustice. And so the justice of Jesus does not look like the violent revolution and overthrow. What it looks like is obedience unto death, even death on a cross. Mm-hmm. And so when he says that Jesus is justice, that means that Jesus was not successfully tempted by the devil,
right,
to actually be the kind of Messiah that if he were fully human and not fully human and fully divine, that he would be that kind of Messiah.
Right. No, that's exactly right. And so if we want to, if we like, it's just kind of straightforward and not that meaningful to say Jesus is justice. It requires exactly that unpacking. What's the shape of life that Jesus enacted himself as the Messiah, as the King of the Jews, as the sovereign one, right? And so that's where we have to attend. So obviously that short sentence, Jesus' justice, has to be filled out
Yeah.
with the form of Jesus' life
Yeah.
itself. And that's what I mean by messianic life when we get further on as well. But also here in terms of the kind of sovereignty, and this is the point, the kind of sovereignty that Jesus enacts doesn't look like sovereignties that we see in the world, right?
Exactly.
It doesn't look like rulers
Yeah.
that we see in the world. It doesn't look like governments that we see in the world whose very existence depends upon effectively coercive power. Okay? I don't think there's a government in the world that exists that isn't fundamentally rooted in coercive power.
No, Derrida is, I think, right about that
Yeah.
in the force of law,
So,
which is why
speaking of law,
sovereignty is so difficult to navigate,
Yes.
especially in the modern era, where we will not appeal to the gods. Where that was kind of the out,
That's
right?
right.
Well, the gods, and it's like, well, okay, well, the gods. If the gods say it, then
Yeah, yeah.
But here we're trying to no, we're the just ones, but we, moved indigenous peoples off their lands, and we, but no, Canadians are, or we're Americans, and we held slaves, and we did the same thing to indigenous peoples, and or it just doesn't matter. Like a modern
Right.
nation state is built on the blood of its
Sure.
victims. That's
Sure,
and
and-
the injustice where it defined, here's the people that it doesn't matter what we do bad things to because they're just bad. And in order for us to have the good life, then now we can start from zero.
Yeah.
Like now we
Exactly.
put down the baddies, we
Yeah.
can start from zero,
Yeah.
kind of thing. Yeah. And Jesus will not enact a sovereignty of that sort, is
No,
what you're saying.
that's right.
Yeah.
And God, the Father of Jesus Christ, reveals His own sovereignty in Jesus Himself. So the appeal of the sovereign to the divine that goes on persistently throughout history. The ruler invokes divine reality to somehow or other warrant that person's rule or that people's rule. Here you get Jesus, the very essence of His sovereignty is revealed on the cross, connected with God the Father, and so divine sovereignty and political sovereignty are bound up together in the crucifixion. But we're getting a.
Yeah.
I would like to go back to
Sorry, it was my fault.
these frames. Okay,
Yeah.
so we've got the frame of the Gentile world with its gods and all of the trouble that its worship of false gods brings. Now, for Paul, as a Jewish person, there is, on the other hand, the revelation of the Torah, okay? The revelation of God's law to the people of Israel through Moses in order to live their life together in the land in a way that honors God, okay? And it's important to understand that Paul never ultimately discards the law or says the law was a bad thing or so on. But what he does toward the end of, basically at the beginning of chapter 3, but also toward the end of chapter 2 of Romans, is say that even the law of Moses, good though it was, did not bring about the justice that we see revealed for us in Jesus. The criterion for Paul always for what justice looks like is the reality of Jesus, the Messiah, the sovereign one, the human being who enacts a certain kind of life, okay? So that's always the criterion. Paul isn't kind of playing off Jewish justice against Gentile justice and so on. No, he's saying the measure of justice is revealed in Jesus Christ. And against that measure, the Torah does, as a system, and I think this is important, the Torah as a kind of system of reality, a kind of depiction of reality, has not brought forth that kind of justice that is revealed for us in the person of Jesus.
So could we sum up perhaps some of the justice that has been revealed in Jesus as non-coercion, even, and that if we are measuring justice by the standard of Jesus, that it has to be a non-coercive method of justice and means of practicing justice as part of the. I know we're going to get to the messianic life. That's the second half of the book. But if we are followers of Jesus in our messianic life, this new way of living, now that our eyes have been opened and we see the world as it really is, it can never involve coercion. And any time that the church has historically participated in coercion, you named some examples. Thank you, Myron. In history, that has been us sinning and not an actual example of the church following
The way of
the
Jesus.
justice of Jesus.
Yeah, and well, we get into a whole lot of issues here, but one of the realities, actually, we're just making our way in my senior theology seminar through another book on the use of the Old Testament throughout Christian history, and the way in which readers, in particular, readers in positions of power, readers of the Old Testament, use the Old Testament to justify their power, to justify their cruelty, to justify all kinds of things. Okay, and very little distinction was made between. What does it mean? Who is Jesus as the sovereign one? What is the shape of his sovereignty? Is there a people called out from the midst of all different kinds of sovereignty to enact something fundamentally different in the world? Okay, all that somehow has gone missing. Okay, so just getting back to Romans 1-3. So we've got the outside frames, early part of chapter 1. Last part of chapter 3, we've got the outside frames, the declaration of the good news of God's justice in Jesus Christ. Then we've got these subframes where Paul critiques, on the one hand, the Gentile system of reality, the Gentile understanding of reality, effectively, and on the other, the Jewish understanding of reality in Torah. Neither of which have brought about the justice of God as revealed in Jesus Christ. Now there's and I just want to pull this out because there's a little section in chapter 2, the first 16 chapters of Romans chapter 2, that have caused real trouble for Protestant readers of Romans, or Protestant readers of Paul. Because it seems like Paul says there that if people do good, they are justified, okay? And that just kind of runs against the grain of the whole Protestant tradition.
And even the way they want to read Romans.
Exactly. It runs against the grain of a whole tradition of reading Romans that says, no, we are justified by grace through faith, not of works, etc., etc. And then you get these 16 verses in Romans chapter 2 where it seems Paul says exactly the opposite.
Right.
My way of negotiating this text has been to read these two subframes, Romans 1:18-32, and the latter part of Romans 2 into Romans 3, to read these subframes as Paul's critique of systems. Okay, it's a systemic critique. And by systemic I mean a critique. Some people today have called it of social imaginaries. Okay. These fundamental orientations,
the way we organize ourselves together socially and try to achieve goodness and justice.
Exactly. You know, it isn't like the pagans were out there just trying to do bad all the time. They're trying to.
No, quite the opposite. Yeah.
Quite the opposite. I mean, they're out there trying to shape a life of flourishing. Likewise, the Torah is there to shape a life of flourishing. But Paul says, ultimately, these systems have not brought about justice and life as has been revealed in the good news. Okay? So, what's Paul doing? He's not, I think often what people say Paul does in Romans 1:18 to 3:19, 3:20 is condemn everybody. Okay? Basically say, look, everybody's damned to hell. And no matter what kind of good works they do, they're still damned to hell. Okay, and so we get, as it were, this kind of individualistic condemnation. And there are texts that seem to suggest this. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. Okay?
Right.
And I don't think Paul for a moment imagines that no human being has not sinned except Jesus. Don't get me wrong. But in the middle of that whole section, he looks, I think he, as it were, turns his gaze from these large-scale systems, namely the pagan gods on the one hand and the Torah on the other, and says, what's life on the ground like amongst ordinary pagans and ordinary Jews? And he looks on the ground and he sees, you know what, there are lots of ordinary pagans who are doing good. And there are, in fact, some Jews who are doing evil.
It kind of reminds me of Jesus taking a look at centurion or the Samaritan woman and saying, I've never seen faith like this. And
Yes.
He's not that she didn't say anything about Yahweh or the Holy Trinity, but he's saying, look, there's real faith.
Yeah.
That's what faith looks like right there.
Exactly.
And it's a bit like that, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So he's taking a look around and saying, well, as a matter of fact, there are moments of just action and
Exactly.
goodness that people do.
Well, and if I may quote you back to you on page 39, I love this explanation of God's wrath, which is something that I historically have really struggled with, the wrath of God. But you say, we must see then that God's wrath is God's mercy. God's wrath against systems of idolatry and injustice is good news for those who are enslaved, downtrodden, and destroyed by them. God's wrath liberates. And again, we're thinking that these systems that are not producing anything good, for the ordinary person, they are downtrodden by them.
Yes.
And it is the same kind of thing that feminists are talking about when they say that patriarchy is bad for everybody. It's not good for men. It's not good for anybody in that system because everyone is trapped and forced into boxes and forced to behave in particular ways. And so God's wrath against those systems is not God's wrath against individual human beings.
Right.
God has incredible compassion for these individual human beings, as Myron has named a number of examples from the Gospels.
Yeah.
And so thinking about it, when it sounds like Paul is condemning these systems of sin, but he is highlighting God's compassion for the people who have been ground down by those systems.
Yes, absolutely. And what I suggest there is that on the ground in the lives of many ordinary people, and you just look around you, right? In the lives of many ordinary people, those lives, in some sense, exceed the systems. Mm-hmm. So even in a patriarchal society, or even in a slave-owning society, there may be ordinary relationships in which the goodness of life shines through.
Sure.
Right?
But it does not change the condemnation and the wrath that is on the system.
Absolutely not. Yeah. Absolutely not. That
actually might be a really helpful way to think about, I guess, some of the bad parts of cancel culture.
Yes.
Which tends to look at, well, let's just roll that all up together and say, well, it's all damned to hell.
Yeah.
Like, well, there were actually some good people that did some good things, but there is at the same time a real legitimate point that this was oppressive and it was bad and it's evil,
Exactly.
and it needs to be opposed and named as such.
Exactly.
So Paul is kind of doing that. Like
you can't just look, for example, at all of the Trump supporters and say they're just all evil. Most of them are probably just ordinary people trying to struggle through life, make enough money to put food on the table, they're good to their neighbors, and so on and so forth. You can't just look at Democrats and say, once again, if you're on the other side, they're just all evil.
Right.
And they know that. You see people just on the ground in a cafe or a diner talking to one another, and they're on opposite sides of the political it's the systems. It's when these people start giving themselves over to these comprehensive visions, these comprehensive systemic realities, and saying that's where life is at. All of a sudden you have enemies created, right?
Well, and I think that's why what we said earlier in our conversation about coercion is so critical here. Because it would be very easy, I think, for non Christians to look at the historic behavior of the Christian church
Yeah.
and say that what we have done is comparable to what the insurrectionists did on January 6th, right? Because it is coercive. It is saying, our way of seeing reality is the only way, and the fact that the rest of y'all don't see it that way, we're going to force you to see it. And if we actually look at the justice of Jesus Messiah, he would hate that we have ever coerced anyone to try and see reality the way that we as Christians see reality. It is choice and consent are critical here. And so the way that we're going to get away from this kind of political enemy piece that you're naming here is to focus, I think, on this lack of coercion, and to say the way that you see reality is your way of seeing reality. If you are a Christian, you always need to be measuring this against the crucifixion specifically, but the witness of Jesus Messiah.
Yeah.
And if you are trying to coerce someone else to see reality that way that you see it, then you are, in fact, falling short of that measure.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I guess personally, am I doing something here? Personally, I wouldn't immediately focus on the issue of coercion, although I think it's fundamental to the very character of Jesus Christ that he is non-coercive. I'm in fundamental agreement with that. But one thing I think is important to... Am I causing problems with my machine here somewhere? Oh, okay. I lost my train of thought.
Wouldn't
You
focus
were
on
saying
coercion.
not coercion.
Right.
You
Well,
have something beyond coercion
right.
you want to focus on.
Right. And so Oh yes. Here okay. For Paul, the gospel is a gospel of power. He says, in fact, and so here's another thing that comes in, okay? Power. Power is a reality of our lives on all kinds of levels in every kind of way. And yet, Paul says the gospel is the power of God for salvation, okay? Now, power, I think we can speak of power without speaking of coercion. But I would nevertheless not like to lose sight of the fact that the good news is God's power. And I think Paul, you know, when he says in Corinthians and when he says in Galatians, I know nothing but Christ crucified, and I came to you and I preached nothing but Christ crucified. I think he understood that message on the one hand to be a message about radical weakness and vulnerability, namely Christ crucified. But that as a message which spoke powerfully and, I'll put it this way, even compellingly into people's lives.
And in a sense, almost, I mean, it's almost a traumatic truth.
Almost a traumatic truth.
Well, no, I'll just say it. It is.
It is.
In the sort of technical sense of trauma.
And when you look at Paul's traumatic encounter with Jesus Christ, I do find it interesting there that Christ nowhere asks for Paul's consent. And so I have called Paul's conversion a conscription.
Yeah.
Now, I mean, here I am, to a certain extent, being metaphorical, but when Paul says I've become a slave of Jesus Christ, and when Paul says Jesus Christ is Lord, there is a dynamic in there that needs to be taken account of, and a dynamic of irresistibility. You know, famous Calvinists call this irresistible grace, right? But Paul is conquered by Christ. The reality of Christ compels Paul into that reality. It draws Paul into that reality. Now, again, none of this is coercive. There's no sword being held over Paul's neck. There's no threat upon Paul. And I find this interesting. I don't think Paul ever goes out with a message of threat.
Right.
And this is what I think you're picking up on when I speak of God's wrath, because often Christians have put out God's wrath as, okay, here's the threat, okay? Get yourself
The
right
carrot
with
or the
God
stick, yeah.
or you're toast.
Exactly.
All right?
Yeah.
Here's the stick, here's the carrot.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you read 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verses 14 and following, you'll see that Paul only ever preaches good news.
Mm-hmm.
But I think he's utterly confident that good news, if rightly preached, is powerful and compelling, such that if people say no to it, they're in some sense denying reality.
Right.
Okay?
Okay, we are going to start to wrap up. We've got actually a couple of questions here online.
right.
So Asher Aber, who is a member of our parish, asks this. Can we sort of say that we've wrapped up more or less the first 3 chapters?
Yep. Let's say that.
Okay. Asher Aber says, what was it about the Roman Church at the time that Paul chose to write this treatise on justice to them? What was it about the Roman Church at the time that Paul chose to write this to them, this treatise on Russian to them? Why them and not the Corinthians and the Galatians? Was there a something specific about the Roman followers, and maybe he means the Roman situation, the Roman followers of Jesus, that required such teaching?
That's a really good question, Asher. And that kind of opens up the whole question of the Roman context, the context of the Roman churches. If you get to chapter 14 in Romans, you see that Paul wants to address any kind of conflicts at the table that might be occur at the communion table, or at basically just the table of eating together. Mm-hmm. That might arise there in the relationship between Jew and Gentile. And many people have kind of focused on that as the primary purpose of Paul's letter to the Romans. So people actually say there are all kinds of purposes for Paul's letter to the Romans. But I think it's a good question to ask. Why does Paul write this letter? Why does Paul write this letter to those people in Rome? Even as Paul knows that, maybe they aren't well educated. They're not well off. They're probably a good number of them. I'm just reading a book on the social makeup of early Christian churches. Probably a good number of them are well below subsistence level. I mean, basically making it from day to day, okay? Why does Paul write such a letter to them? Well, I think Paul writes a letter to them because they're in Rome, okay? And Roman reality is reality for them. In that city, even if they're at the bottom of the socioeconomic heap and the political heap, Roman reality is the real. It's the real world for them. And so Paul, I think, wants to redescribe the world to Roman Christians in Rome because it's Rome.
Right.
And if this means for Paul, I mean, you can read the letters to the Corinthians and to the Philippians and Thessalonians. They aren't so difficult. Their meanings are often fairly straightforward, and you can see in the context of those particular struggling communities how these letters kind of spoke immediately to their situation. Mm-hmm. You can't see that so much in Romans.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
And this is why I think I call Romans a treatise. And a treatise means that you are, as it were, writing not so much to a particular situation as you are writing, in a sense, to declare a case, okay? And for Paul, What Paul wants to do, I think, even though he probably just realizes that these Roman Christians aren't going to understand a lot of what he's saying, even as most Christians I mean, I'm the only one who's really understood him. Just kidding. I mean, commentaries abound on this letter, as Myron said right at the beginning. But I think Paul is aiming this letter at a higher level. I think there's no question that he wants it to speak gospel truth into the midst of those congregations in Rome. But I think he's aiming this letter at a higher level because this is his moment, as it were, to lay out an alternative vision of reality to the Roman reality.
Okay.
And so that's my thought about this question, and I think that's a very good question, Asher.
Thank you, Asher, for that question. Carrie Whitebear asks this question: why does justice and mercy mingle?
Well, I think, again, a very good question. For Paul, justice and mercy come together as one in God's act of justice in Jesus Christ. And that comes out especially, I didn't talk much about Romans 3:21 to 26, but basically there Paul says, now the justice of God is revealed apart from law in Jesus as the very site of God's mercy.
Mm-hmm.
So, and that's what I think that word mercy seat or hilasterion, or that there's a big theological word in the middle of there that a lot of people debate about. But I think fundamentally what Paul says, Jesus himself is that place where the justice of God and the mercy of God are one and the same thing. Okay? So they don't just mingle, they actually become identical in Jesus, in God's work in Jesus Christ. Yeah, good question.
Well, thank you very much for those questions. Thank you very much to Doug Herink for sharing this time with us, and thank you also, Jordan, for your participation and involvement in this. Thank you for all of you who have streamed this. I invite you again next week, same time, same station, 7 p.m. here at St. Paul's. We'll be streaming it live on all the same platforms where you've reached us this time. And yeah, spread the word if you found this something that was helpful and fun and stretching. Something that's part of your Lent discipline as you maybe start to think about scriptures in a different and more deep way. Please share that and invite others to join. Thank you very much. And we'll sign off now. So thank you.
Thank you.